Great.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are. My name is Cindy Grace McCaskey. I am an anthropologist at East Carolina University in North Carolina. My co-convener, it appears, was not able to join us today. Not heard from her. I hope everything is okay. And she was also going to be presenting. So that means that we 1, 2, 3 papers in this session, which is called Institutional Frameworks for Coastal and Marine Resource Management, Critiques of and Advances in Governance Approaches. So if it is all right with the presenters, I thought we would just go in the order that it's listed in the agenda. So starting with Linus, and then Anya, and then Ted. And that's actually good because then if Victoria shows up, she can join us at the end.
All right, can we all see this okay?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Linus, for starting us off, and good morning or afternoon to everyone. My name is Anya Sjostrom. I am a third-year PhD candidate at East Carolina University, and I work with Cindy, who's chairing this session. And this is a bit of sort of exploratory scoping work that we're doing as we're shifting back into field work in the US Caribbean in looking at implementing ecosystem-based fisheries management in that area and the challenges and advances therein. So just a couple of talking points. I'm not going to belabor this, but I'll go through some of the basics of ecosystem-based fisheries management and specifically zoom in on the US process where we're working and the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration's policy in order to move towards this discussion around suitability of EBFM to small-scale fisheries and looking at our US Caribbean case study and some of those challenge and benefits. We'll touch on just a couple of frameworks, and then I'd really like this to move into, at the end, once we're done with talk, some discussion and questions around EBFM and similar management approaches as they're being applied globally to small scales. So I would imagine that most of us have become familiar with EBFM in some context, but just to describe some of the differences and synergies between acronyms and frameworks, EBFM has become popularized due to its potential to generate this more holistic approach than single species management. It's designed to be more inclusive of social and ecological components on short and longer term scales within fishery systems. And it's all embedded within the paradigms of ecosystem management. So at the top of this figure here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but EBM is more of a marine spatial planning context where you're embedding all of these different management strategies, looking at development, different aquacultural areas and cultural use rights. And then scientific advice of the sectors of management build with each level, as well as the management framework. And so the two key differences I'd like to highlight are between ecosystem approaches to fisheries management and EBFM. Those are the premier that we're seeing adopted globally. EBFM is different in that it considers trade-offs of multiple species as opposed to the single stock fishery approach that EAFM is still adopting, even though in a broader ecosystem-wide context. And EBFM is taking this more coordinated look at multiple species as opposed to stocks within one fishery. And so this is the US policy run by National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration in the US. And this is their formal definition of EBFM, which I'll let you read over, but it's strongly supporting the implementation of this process to home in on the interconnectedness of ecosystem and human communities that depend on them in the hopes of promoting resilience and productive ecosystems. Again, this is really shifting away from single species management programs and moving towards a more holistic strategy that accounts for ecosystems that can be considered inclusive of their human components. And so NOAA has put forth sort of this roadmap or blueprint to EBFM, and the implementation process is outlined to occur through multiple lines of cumulative action, gradually transitioning to comprehensive management of living marine resources. And that starts with determining what are our objectives. And this is designed to be done with various stakeholder groups along the process, assisting with fisheries ecosystem plans as sort of an umbrella planning approach And then moving into those key components that are identified from those interactive first stages and conducting science to both understand and fulfill ecosystem status reports for large marine ecosystems. And then what are the priorities? Moving these living marine resources and associated fisheries communities, looking at relative vulnerability to human and natural pressures, determining individual and cumulative pressures that associate the most risk to resources and dependent communities. And then that next stage is, what are those options? So a big part of ecosystem-based fisheries management is really doing a thorough trade-off analysis early on, looking at benefit optimization with regional socioeconomic considerations, ecosystem-specific policy goals and objectives, and then shifting these management strategy evaluations towards ecosystem-wide management advice that can be brought up to the councils in the broader ecosystem context, creating ecosystem level reference points, incorporating ecosystem considerations, and then integrating advice for other management across regions. And then lastly, coming back to, are we maintaining resilient ecosystems inclusive of their human components, evaluating fishery community well-being. And so this is operating under the Magnuson-Stevenson Act, which is the premier fisheries policy in the US. And then NOAA through this is allowed to supply technical advice to assist our 9 regional fisheries management councils to implement these EBFM programs. And so what Dr. Grace McCaskey and I have been thinking about is, as the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council, the area that we work, is beginning to shift towards this process, is EBFM a suitable approach for small scale fisheries in this area, but also at a more global scale? The area we work, that you have island nations that are impacted by population growth, by tourism, development and biodiversity loss. Small scale fisheries like the ones found in the Caribbean employ the greatest diversity of gear types. And scientists believe that there's this declining trend in the mean trophic level that's driving fishing down the food web that impact the system's ability to maintain fishing effort through time. And I chose this quote because I think it encapsulates some of the unique complexity of our coral reef ecosystems, from Valdez-Pizzini et al. The current state of the biodiversity of the ecosystems of the Caribbean is a complex predicament developed from the interactions of human populations and their cultures and their history of occupation throughout the region. And thus it requires an understanding of the human and natural dimensions of the problem and a research and conservation strategy that unifies both experiences. And so within this study, Valdez-Pizzini et al. Looked at the large marine ecosystem for Puerto Rico fisheries and established that it requires a framework that accounts for the historical processes of fisheries, looking at institutions and practices, that it needs to be democratic and participatory, using best available science as well as local ecological knowledge, and working towards a holistic approach that's inclusive of biological, economic, social, cultural, and governance dynamics to engage in adaptive forms of management and maintain sustainability. And there are a lot of embedded challenges in this because EBFM requires novel databases of indicators. It requires a lot of creativity around multidisciplinary inputs and management. And the social data is often poorly integrated and lagging behind. There tends to be a dearth of historical, cultural, and economic data that's used, and that requires better frameworks. And one of the big one that has been pushed in the context of EBFM is the social ecological systems framework, and reaching towards better human dimensions integration. So thinking about the benefits of EBFM in the context of the Caribbean and more broadly, one of the big strong potential areas is that it aggregates working groups. And this can be more efficient than the time-consuming, cost-intensive, expertise-intensive individual stock management plans, which can be beneficial for areas like the Caribbean that can be a bit more staff limited, scientific monitoring limited. It's moving towards this more holistic approach that's considering trade-offs ecosystem-wide, and that can promote more resilient and adaptive management, including this process of full integration with stakeholders and buy-in at the get-go. It can support short and long-term objectives. So it's an evolving process for areas that need time to develop measures and expand resources and monitoring. And this can work towards long-term marine system resilience, marine spatial planning, or short-term agenda items. And another interesting thing is that you can, within the context of social ecological systems and EBFM, consider things like embedding co-management within an EBFM process so that you're meeting different aspects of social and ecological dimensions at appropriate scales. The criticisms and a lot of the challenges is that a lack of data or other resources can be cited as something that would prevent a region from adopting EBFM. This can be remedied with more localized fisheries ecosystem plans, starting with conceptual modeling, which is something that the Caribbean Council is doing, and that allows for this more adaptive and evolving approach. There's also a lot of talk around a lack of common definition and what that does for hindering the move of EBFM from conceptual to operational. And another big one in our region and more broadly is that stakeholders tend to perceive it to be biophysically or conservation motivated. And this can promote distrust and pit stakeholders against each other, create barriers to participation. It's something that the current conceptual modelers are experiencing with some of the NGOs in the US Virgin Islands. And the models are complex. It requires a lot of different expertise. And if you have a limited staff environment, limited balance between social and ecological proponents, this can be a real hurdle. And again, that comes back to challenges across integration and partnerships and the importance of partnerships between natural and social sciences in implementation processes. And that's something that Valdez Bazzini and his colleagues saw in Puerto Rico as well. So social ecological systems is widely prevalent in the literature around EBFM, stating that EBFM should be considered social ecological systems, focusing on the biophysical, looking at the food web dynamics, climate, bycatch and habitat, as well as the social, looking at the well-being, equity, economics and cultural world dynamics in balanced ways. And this is just a very simple breakdown of a social ecological system, but you're looking at these two-way feedbacks between various oceanographic, ecological, fine and larger scale ecological subsystem processes, and then in the social system also as across various scales of governance and local management. And again, coming back to this idea of co-management as nested within an EBFM process. Co-management is more focused on social benefits, and the EBFM process leans more into the detailed outcomes biophysically and towards conservation ecosystem indicators. So this could potentially be a strong coupling within a social ecological framework. So just to touch on where the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council process is, I would also be interested to hear others' experiences around implementation of similar management regimes. But it starts with a fisheries ecosystem plan, and this is what's called the FEP loop, Fisheries Ecosystem Plan loop from NOAA and several papers. And it's designed to generate space from the management realm to better address all components of what they call the triple bottom line, this environmental, economic, and social. And it's also supposed to be iterative, kind of shares features of the integrative ecosystem assessment approach. And the Caribbean Council is in the first stages of this. Each region then develops this implementation and roadmap with short, medium, and long-term milestones. They develop their engagement strategies and key components, and that gradually shifts into fisheries management plans for each of the individual islands in the archipelago. And so all things considered with COVID and other limitations, the Caribbean Council is in the process of finishing up their conceptual modeling and will be moving into a risk analysis as they're trying to build towards this scientific process in stage 3. So this is the part I'm excited about this talk, but coming back to discussion and thinking about EBFM, one of the big things that we're trying to work towards in the Caribbean is identifying the most practical areas and engaging with broad stakeholder groups. Who should be present at meetings, who should have a stake in these, and how do we get them there? And that's obviously considerably more challenging in small scale fisheries that experience wealth divides and other hurdles. And how do we get towards this integration of local and regional knowledge in EBFM processes? So Jones and Ciara did this study in 2020 that looked at 2 of the regional council perceptions of EBFM elements and their implementation processes. And the idea was to develop sort of a pilot survey to understand fishery views of identified elements from the council and general EBFM. And what they saw was that council members saw a lack of acceptance and regulation and enforcement as a barrier to the successful implementation, while on the other hand, fishers felt that this lack of inclusion in decision-making and sense of welcome was a hindrance to their participation and management. And so that's a big deal in trying to get everyone in the room together and work from the ground up on EBFM implementation. So we keep coming back to this question of, does a lack of data have potential to force an EBFM approach? Does this lack of single stock data approach and expertise actually force something that could look at ecosystems more holistically and engage with local collective action components and ways of knowledge sharing? And could this potentially be a necessity for small scale fisheries like the US Caribbean? And then another interesting aspect of this is considering scales of connection and governance. So can councils actually be seen as regional forms of co-management? Is there this potential synergy between EBFM and co-management in a Caribbean context? So just to wrap up, obviously this is very preliminary, but in conclusion, we think that there's this interesting question around EBFMs being suited to small scale fisheries that lack a capacity to follow single species approaches. And I'm interested in hearing thoughts and similar experiences, but talking about nested co-management EBFM approaches that might work well in island archipelagos that support small scale fisheries. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to some discussion at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Anya. Yeah, looking forward to continued discussion about that. And let's see. I did hear from my co-convener, and she had a medical emergency, so she will not be joining us. She's okay, but she will not be joining us. So our last paper will be Theodore and Sophia, who I believe are both on the call here or on the meeting.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, so I'll share my screen for now. Okay. So let's share screen. Okay, and I'll be giving the presentation essentially, but Sophia will be backing me up, in the whole process. So let me just, okay, I'm sharing screen. One moment. Didn't want to do it. Okay, can you see my screen?
I think there's a little bit of a delay, but I see that it shows you trying to share. So here we go. Yes, I believe, although we are seeing a Zoom.
Yeah, I know. You're just
okay.
seeing. Okay, so now you'll see the slides. Okay,
Yes.
so let's just. So there's a little bit of a delay. So let's start the slideshow. So one moment.
Sure.
Okay, so all right. So in a moment, everyone should be able to see that. Okay, waiting for a while. So yeah, can you see it or not? Not yet.
Not in presentation mode yet. We are seeing the PowerPoint, the larger.
Oops, it didn't. Yeah, now it should.
There, yes.
Okay. Okay, now you see it. Okay, so right. Hello, hello to everyone from the islands of Greece and the adjacent coastlines. All right. So today we're going to. Well, I'm going to try, along with Sophia's help, to present some work we've been doing on a participatory process, which is a largely anthropological process, but tailored to the needs of conservation and conflict resolution, basically mapping for historical rights. Now, the project had other things. We are mapping for ecosystems and certain keystone species, such as vultures, dolphins, and a few other things that are keystone in the area. But today we're just going to present some preliminary results from the historical rights part of the thing. You can see our coastline in the area, the island and the mainland. The mainland is a big part, the more drier part, and I'll tell you why it's so different in a moment. Okay, so this is where we are. The area is a high biodiversity area, an area also that has very high conflict. environmental conflict, in any literature that I have searched at least, and we found is we are like really, really deep in a hotspot for conflict in the marine environment in this area. The Greek seas are a hotspot for environmental conflict right now for a variety of reasons. Aquaculture in the area, we now have mapped those 20-something farms. A very, very important aquacultural frontier that is expanding and wishes to expand even further. Industrial fishing that's been here since the 50s. The conservation industry that's moving very rapidly into the area. And when I mean conservation industry, I do mean it in the terms of an industry. I do not mean happy conservation practitioners wishing to do their best. And sorry if that offends anyone. Renewable energy industry, they want to put basically wind farms and solar farms everywhere, and I do mean everywhere. Oil and gas exploration wants to move into the area. They have a block. Real estate infrastructure has been here for a while. Forestry management and other types of infrastructure projects. Now, there are primarily two ethnic types of groups, you could say, in the area, the islanders and the mainlanders. The part that we'll focus on this day will actually be the one about the nomads and the semi-nomads. That's because their land is actually the most impacted so far. That's because the development project started as early as the 1830s. Settling nomads and semi-nomads was really the norm for the government. Anyway, until mid-1800s, we have paleontological records that show that the mainland was actually very densely wooded, forested. They brought in logging industries in the area. A fully functional ecosystem was there, and it was recently, at least in the sea, here as well with us until a few decades ago. Anyway, right now let's go for mapping for right. So we have a lot of pressure in the area. I'm not going to go through it too much right now. We have, however, a very good potential, well, very bad potential, very significant potential, I would say, for conflict. What we're trying to do is actually get those rights, see the historical rights for different communities on sea and land for important activities, fishing and nomadic grazing, big herding in the mainland. What we have found was that it was a very, long procedure to get some of this data. Basically, it's not, it wasn't the most complicated thing to do in terms of methodology. We just did open-ended interviews, participatory process, participatory GIS as well. We chose two systems, one fishing, one grazing, because they are actually a source of collecting protein, basically, from land. Okay, so let me just now go to the link to the interactive map to show you a few more things. Let's see if that works. We've been mapping basically fishing grounds and grazing grounds, fishing grounds in the sea and grazing grounds on land, and it doesn't seem to be wanting to show, so sorry. Let me just go here. Oops. And we go. I'm sorry, it's not working on my screen very well. Yes, here it is. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go first on the fishing grounds. Okay, so you can see that we've done some work with the communities, basically through interviews. Now, the maps you see are the fishing grounds for communities of these two islands, Kalamos and Kastos, and two adjacent mainland communities that did not exist in the 1830s. Okay, I repeat, now whether or not these fishing grounds were there for the nomadic tribes that actually herded their flocks, that's something we're still looking at. Probably not very significantly. These tribes, the way I understand it from being a local, because I am a local in the area, they really had a very poor relationship with the sea. Anyway, you can see here some interesting things. You can see a very significant, area where the communities of the different, we can see different villages. We have Calamos village here, Castos village here, would go fishing for a variety of fisheries. We can also see here two types of sites. These are sites for what we call bonito. If anyone's ever heard of the fish, very popular in sushi restaurants. Bonito is a type of small mackerel type fish, and it had like a big spawning aggregation where they would spawn for many months. The fishery here was one of the best in the Mediterranean at some point, by the way, until the early 50s at least. So these were waiting line systems. So people would literally wait in line to actually catch the fish for months. The fish would go to breed. As soon as their heads would go up, people would go and catch them with a special net, and that would continue for like months and months every year. So a huge amount of fish in those areas, at least, you know, for what we have at present. Another smaller area that I have here, which actually is not compared to the other areas, it's for the people of Meganisi. This area that they actually went down here to actually, according to the local, you know, elders from the two islands here. So just Calamos and Castos. Okay, so this is fishing grounds for the two islands, based on these elders from these two islands for Calamos and Castos. However, you should know and understand that, you know, as you can also see, the fishing grounds were largely complementary. So that means that some complement on each other, and it also means that we don't have, you know, yet the information for the other islands and the other villages. For example, Meganisi here, you know, their fishing ground would probably reach all the way down here and back here. And they would also be on the waiting line system for this and this. And they would somehow, we're still trying to figure out, have rights to a specific kind of sardine. You know, sardine can change sex. So it was the low quality blue sardine, as we call it. So this was it. And you can see here the fishing grounds here of the other villages. This village, this is Astacos, which didn't exist in the 1830s. They happened later, Mythicas. You can see that their fishing grounds are a lot more limited. That's probably because they haven't been fishing for a very long time, or because they had other occupations. And now that takes us to nomadic grazing. So let's just see if the map will show eventually. Sorry. So with nomadic grazing, what we did, the approach did not involve participatory, you know, questions so far. It has involved extensive literature surveys from other projects that have done it. Okay, so you can see different nomadic routes. Let me just show you. So there are two main tribal, as we call them, because we should call them tribal people, even though the term indigenous may be a little bit arbitrary. You can see that there was a very dense population of people moving around this landscape in those areas. There were sedentary settlements, but they were very limited. This was a landscape that was basically there for moving. So these were basically the summering grounds. The wintering grounds were on the flatlines here on the coastal areas, while the wintering grounds were very high up. Mountains. Okay, let's go a little bit up the mountains. So they were really high up here and here. You can see some of that as they start. So really extensive areas. Of course, grazing was done here in the summer, as I said. Some areas they were excluded from, the wooded areas, traditionally and historically. After the government settled them, they said everything is nationalized or privatized, so they applied a completely different model, which produced a lot of environmental damage. And if you ask me personally, as a local from the area, did not bring the socioeconomic benefits that were anticipated. Anyway, what you can see here is also some very interesting results. So you can see that, you know, you would expect that one of the villages here, for example, Episkopi, which is in Mythica, is in Calamos. It's on the back here. It's actually where I'm drawing it with my mouse. Actually has a very limited fishing ground. well, people might ask, why is that? Well, we're still trying to figure out why, even though they were island, even though they were traditionally there, even though they were traditionally doing this at a specific time before there were settlements even. Well, the answer is probably has to do with the fact that people in this area, so there was a very utilitarian model. So they actually, just they had this forest which had laurel. Now, if you know bay leaves from the supermarket, you probably have bought it or seen it, to use in cooking. Well, in the old days, you couldn't just grow it in any places. There was a very shadowy part of the mountain here that you could grow it. They would export it as far as Russia. So it was a very important resource that they had exclusivity to. So that was probably why the communities had agreed with themselves, in the islands at least, to barter in this way, although we're still looking for that. Just so that you know, it's probable that because the islands had a different historical context, the mainland was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Ionian Islands were part of the Empire of Venice and then the British Commonwealth. It's probable also that's one of the very strong component that these people and these fishing grounds that you see from the mainland communities are a recent event after the creation of the new Greek state and people were settled. Probably it's because the communities of these islands actually allowed them to do so. Okay, and another thing about the nomadic, movements, I would tell you that there's now attempts to even revive some of those movements, and that some of those movements are even occurring now as we speak, but in a very different manner. Also, one final thing that I'd like to say is that you see some of the movements here on the coastline. There now, all of these areas have been turned into roads, which can be a potential problem for that. You can see here national parks, protected areas, but I'm not going to go into that too much. I'm just going to proceed with my presentation. Okay, so the nomadic movements were vertical, as we call them, based on Celigato and Siflik traditions, which is an Ottoman tradition. Smooth fisher movements were horizontal. They were, in essential, semi nomads of the sea, because a lot of the people would actually migrate to some of the outer islands that you saw on the map that is here. So these islands, there are some islands down here. So they would go up and down with seasons to actually catch some fisheries, and they would stay in their boats, and they would stay on land or on semi-permanent adobe type settlements, even until like the 1950s and the 60s. Shared space was a key feature. I told you, you should not view these absolutely these fishing grounds as my area versus your area with absolute borders. They were general, like consider them a little bit like globes. So you could see a person from Meganisi going all the way down to the south here, but that was actually very rare in those days. Of course, things have changed now. Now, we do have the potential for community conserved areas to have occurred, or even indigenous conserved areas on land, not on sea, on land. We know that they have existed for forest examples on the mainland and grazing grounds, and forest examples on the islands as well. We believe that there is very strong evidence that there have been marine community conserved areas as well. We're still investigating that, but the evidence is clearly there for us so far. Now, a little bit about consideration of rights. So we really need to consider a few things. Right now, there is an approach which says the sea is for everyone approach, but this is an approach that is erroneous. Because what we have seen with our mapping is that people have not been, they have been specialized. Each community had specialization, its specific borders. They interacted with each other. The government had this notion, and later even experts right now, conservation organizations, they follow the government in that, and they say no, that everyone is the same. Someone's living there, someone's living there. The sea is for everyone. There was apparent sustainability in the system. I mean, we have evidence to support that. The seas for everyone's argument is not supported. I can tell you that most of the seas for everyone argument is supported by mainland people whose land has been more degraded. Our seas have been degraded more recently. That's because technology was not available to actually do ecosystem mining, which has been basically what has been going on in the mainland now. Of course, things have improved since the 1830s and the early 1900s and the 1950s. We had in this country, our last military regime ended in the mid-1970s. So you're going to have to understand that, governance was not really an issue to be addressed for the environment for several years after that. Okay, so conservation consideration. We have to take under account how the management of the landscapes and the seascapes was until very recently. Historical rights are very crucial, and they're very crucial because of local ecological knowledge and connection to the systems. I've been told by conservation experts we should all get you together in one room and you should all sit down and decide along with the industry. And I told them, that's not very fair. Industry has come here and has done significant ocean and land grabbings. Okay, people are revolting to that. Putting them on the same table is not fair. We don't believe it's fair. There is the tradition now. There is I talk to a lot of anthropologists and other conservation experts, and they really have this holy grail thing that sacredness can actually be like a holy grail for conservation. Well, I can tell you that from our area, that doesn't really seem to be the case. It really seems that we have a very utilitarian tradition, even though the spawning sites and the waiting line systems that you saw did have a waiting line system that they did have a connection to a sacred site, a very sacred holy site. There were 2 churches, sacred icons, all of that. But the site itself was not sacred. The site itself, where the fish would breed, were not essentially sacred. But it did help with conflict, so that people didn't, go up and down, fighting each other for fish, because it was that. But it wasn't sacred in the way that people would say, don't touch or treat with respect. So this utilitarian tradition is probably the most important thing that I have to think, along with historical rights for the area. We shouldn't have the where we stand right now and what you do today basis. And finally, I really, have to, from the bottom of my heart, say that fortress conservation is being promoted in the area, and it's being promoted with top-down projects, big NGOs wanting to move in, the complexity of the relationships that I just showed you shows that fortress conservation will not solve any problems. In fact, we expect them to aggravate it. I have told to conservation organizations, should I be rallying people against the fortress conservation project as well in the area? Because obviously these rights and these systems that have developed were sustainable, and restoring the systems and the relationships of the people with the land and the water is a crucial thing. And these data shows that you shouldn't just ignore it, or you shouldn't just consider it a thing of the past. Restoring traditional forms of governance is the key. We have had them in the area. Council of Elders, there's still people who are even alive that were the last Council of Elders from our islands, at least, for some of these systems, which I won't go into now because we don't have time. And that's pretty much all I had planned to say. Okay, so I hope that it has been illuminating. We can have further discussions and questions later. And that's it. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Thank you both for sharing. And yeah, and I guess I would just like to open it up to discussion and questions. It seems everybody has the ability to unmute and put their camera on if they would like to ask their questions in person, or please feel free to type them into the chat and we can direct them.
Okay, well, right.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any in the chat, but please feel free to jump in, anybody. I do have, I have a couple questions. First, for Linus, I'm curious, you mentioned about the illegal fishers and the illegal traders. And so I'm curious what that was like trying to interview them, and what is that? I have experience interviewing people who are not necessarily wanting to share and mistrustful, and so I'm curious what that was like for you.
Oh, it was a very difficult process. So to say, it took me a couple of years to establish a strong collaborations with the communities and fishing communities where I work. So that probably was the essential key to me being able to get access to those illegal fishers and illegal traders. It's highly difficult, actually. It's very, very difficult. And so, but I think I was lucky. I'm a fluent Russian speaker. That also helped, I guess, that I know Russian very well. I'm not a Russian myself, but people would consider myself as a Russian. But there were many hurdles on the way, so to say, and challenges. So it was very hard. I mean, I just can go into very many anecdotes from my fieldwork, and I don't know how, but there are just so many. Just trying sort of kind of one of the most extreme is the kind of being kidnapped in the sort of middle of the night and all that things, you know. So yeah, so there are, it's very, very difficult bit of work, but again, my collaborations proved to be very kind of good investment, actually, and actually that brought me finally to quite successful bit of work. Actually, I met pretty much I interviewed pretty much 80, because a bit of my PhD deals also on the quantification of bycatch, and I didn't really touch upon the subject because it's not really related. And I interviewed 80% of all illegal fishers in the Dagestan, so kind of quantified pretty much. I know pretty much everything about how these things work there. So yeah, but it was very difficult work, I have to say.
I bet. Anya, I see your hand up. Is that a question for Linus? Okay.
Yeah, Linus, thank you for sharing really interesting work. And I also know very little about the region, but I'm curious about the awareness of seal protection in the area, whether there's conservation agencies present, what some of the management structure is there. Because it sounds like it's a pretty challenging environment to work in to begin with, but when you have charismatic megafauna and bycatch and fishing, that tends to garner a lot of attention.
Yeah, management structures for Caspian, like I when I started working in the region, I started as independent researcher, because at that time I burned for fish, for sturgeons, but then I became a part of the Caspian International Conservation Team, which mainly is run by actually my supervisor, my boss. So he is actually, so it's an international flock of people who are providing consultancies to the governments on what conservation interventions need to be put in place. And so basically it's up to the governments and local communities to follow those interventions or not, because so in terms of scientific advising, we're quite well advanced, and we know a bit about the Caspian seal population as well. There's been a series of publications about the modeling, species distribution, habitat distribution, And also historic hunting, which I also mentioned, has a uniquely good records actually dating back into 700s, which is quite unique actually. So basically, when it boils down to the centralized, which is still being practiced, a centralized Soviet type management of fisheries, and Caspian seal kind of management was part of fisheries, and kind of seals are considered as a kind of fish actually from their standpoint. So those are essentially virtually non-absent. I mean, all the scientific advice that were provided by international bodies are essentially ignored. So it's not based on evidence, as far as I understand, and as far as I understand, it's a highly politicized process. So not transparent decision making. So I don't know how actually decisions. I spent so many years in the region. I still don't understand how they draw the decisions on quotas, for example, which target species should be. So one good thing is that now they have closed the sturgeon fisheries, and they also added Caspian seal to the red data book in Russia and Kazakhstan, which is a slight step forward. But again, I think it's a bit too late, too little, so to say, and actually still these measures are insufficient and lacking to protect seals. But and I haven't seen so far that any of those management bodies would be interested to adopting sound solutions to the very harsh issues that there are in the region. So I don't know if that answers to your question.
Okay, and then I see there's another question in the chat for Linus. And Sorrel, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Would you like to ask that, or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I can. Yeah, sorry, there was a bit of background noise here, so I didn't read it out. Yeah, I was just really interested in the Q method as a way to kind of gauge people's perceptions and understandings. And so I was wondering, I've never used it. I was wondering how you found it, what was good or not good about it.
I think it was quite good way actually because the statements that I used in my work was very well grounded in ethnographic work and work as an anthropologist actually in the region for the couple of years. So I was knowing what to ask basically, and some of actually other sources that can be used. I think for the Q method is interesting that the key to success is the statements actually. If you have a sound understanding of the topic and you know the issues that they are there, so I think that would be quite interesting study actually. Well, there are also minuses to Q studies, as we all know. Actually, the problem is that it designed to study small groups of people, so it's really hard to extrapolate whether those viewpoints and how well those viewpoints are prevailing among the broader population, because always policymakers can make that argument that, oh, you just spoke to two people and you kind of know everything. Isn't that so? But for kind of to address that concern, I kind of try to interview as many stakeholders from as many diverse communities as possible. So essentially, I surveyed the entire coast of Dagestan, basically included as diverse people with as diverse backgrounds as possible. So, but in total, I'm very happy that I selected this method, and I think it also gives a very robust understanding on the actually which conservation measures need to be adopted and whether actually these conservation measures that are very sensitive, actually, any of those marine protected areas, kind of regulations, they're all like a gunpowder. It's just such a sensitive issues. So, but actually they kind of reflect what exactly communities support, and to gain that support behind the communities is very vital actually for the policy making nowadays, that you can show to the governments that exactly this is how things are supported in local areas. So yeah, those are my 2 thoughts.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I have a couple of raised hands. I'm not sure who came first, so I'll just go in order on my screen. I see Sophia.
Morning, everyone. I have a question for both Anya and Ted, actually combining the 2 presentations, and whether or not the EBFM mechanisms that Anya was speaking of, how they interact or intersect with what Ted was talking about with respect to historic rights. So if both of you could chime in about whether or not that framework does incorporate historic rights, and then Ted, if EBFM has room somewhere in the Inner Ionian Sea.
Okay, Anya first, I think.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, I mean, the interesting part of this work is that Cindy actually did her dissertation work in the US Virgin Islands. And so she has done a long-term ethnography of the region and knows a lot of the trust and dynamics, and she might be able to speak a little bit more to that. But where I see the EBFM process interacting historically and that being a challenge is this coming back to this idea of moving from conceptual to operational, that there's not a very, very clear rubric for how this is supposed to be done. And like a lot of marine environments, especially in a country as large as the US that has such diverse coastal margins and different cultural and historic practices, I think that becomes a very place-based process. I know that there's been a lot of effort towards integrating Indigenous knowledge and traditional sovereignty and management practices into EBFM design along the West Coast. And I think that the St. Croix Caribbean region is unique in that it does support not being a fully encompassed US state, being US territory. It has a lot of interactions with external island communities, and the demographics are very different, and really does support a small scale fishing community that's unique to the US. That would be important to integrate historical knowledge into, from something like Cindy's work that has, can lead into the colonial practices and some of those long-term drivers of cultural practice and collective action. So hope that answers that a little bit. And Cindy, if you want to chime in.
I think good job, Anya.
Can I make a comment? Yes. So all of these processes, there's always, I have seen, EBFM looks promising. Okay, I'm not going to say something about it because I say it looks very promising to me. But I have seen there's 2 inherent flaws usually with these processes. One is a lot of the assumptions they make, because you have to make some assumptions. So I have told you, I've been approached by pretty big conservation NGOs in the area, like top, and they suggested an approach which was more or less like that. But at the same time, I told them, how are you going to, right now there are people who are rallying and making like open protesting, putting up their naked bodies against the aquaculture industry, and you want to put them in the same table with them. I will not support that. I told them, no, I am not going to support that. So that's one assumption that is wrong. So not everyone should be the same, okay? And not everyone, just because they're there, they should be a valued stakeholder, okay? The other thing has to do with governance that I see. So a main problem we have when this approach gets, is that the ministry runs the show, okay? So the ministry, why should the ministry run the show? The ministry is, has some, jurisdiction in the area. It has some, power or whatever you want to call it. But why should we have someone run the show out from the outside that is going to put everyone who is supposedly legally there on the outside, but they may not be legally there if you look at it on the human rights approach or on the international levels approach. Okay, so there are these inherent flaws, not because the methodology is flawed, okay? But when it is applied, it has to go through a funnel of politics and economics, okay? And when it has to go through that funnel, it usually will fail the ecological and the social system that is on the ground. So that is what I see that could happen in my area here, okay? I would certainly not, like it to be applied on after going through the funnels that I told you. So what they have been doing in other parts of the world, for example, like in Canada with the IPAs, Indigenous Protected Areas, is that they've been, at least in that level, when applying such models, at least they've been accepting that the locals should actually, decide who sits on the table, and they should be the ones to actually be the main decision makers within the limits of the law. So in that context, that is what I think about this, and that's also the dangers about these things, that these things should not be so externally imposed and so mindlessly, organized. And it can happen, not because the people are not, or the ministries or even have, don't have genuine intents. It's just because there is this desire to actually get over with it. There's these deadlines, these vertical structures that have to be, fulfilled. For example, in this country, they tell us until you should complete all forest related mapping until what is it, April 2022. Okay, that's, after 200 years of doing nothing, that is bound to lead to problems. And it's the same thing with what I told you in a more local level. So after 150 years of basically doing random stuff, now you want to do a whole procedure like EBFM, for example, could be that. But you want to do it in a time scale which does not allow for the other time scales that have had, to explain in a way. So it doesn't allow for the whole process it's not enough time. So another concern that I have with these things is time. So 3 to 4 years is not usually enough. A process like that can take decades if it's done right. And right now, everyone is rushing to, the 30-30 subject, nature-based solutions. We need to do things now, and that's something, more protected areas, more, projects, instead of actually trying to just solve issues in the existing areas where there's protected areas or there's existing conflict zones. We just create more protected areas that sound nice. So, how you approach it and how much effort you put is also crucial. So that's my comments on that. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think, Anya and I would both agree with you. There's the local context that needs to be taken into consideration. And, for example, with the US Caribbean, and the fisheries management process in general in the US, I think there's an attempt, whether it's genuine or not, to include local voices. And there's challenges in doing so, even at the local level, even getting people to come to the table, there's just resistance in even participating for good reasons. But those are not things that are easily overcome. So I think it's a very, very lengthy process. And I don't think there are any one size fits all solutions, right? I mean, there are no sort of savior approaches, the 30 by 30 and EBFM, whatever it is. I don't think there are, one size fits all solutions. Okay, and I see another hand, and my apologies if I don't say your name correctly, but I believe Chep.
Yes, you've said my name correctly. I've enjoyed this, the overview from both Anya. I missed for Linus, but for Theodore, it really resonates with the East African context, whereby traditional fisheries are not they don't have much data to back up their traditional rights, I was really impressed with how you're able to to use different sources to be able to show how people have immigrated in and out, you know, and the small places whereby there is historical rights, but you wonder why it's so small and other places are so big. And then you also have the context of the you've called it semi-nomads. In the Western Indian Ocean, we call it immigrant fishing, whereby people go to different areas to fish because of just the winds are taking them there, and also the fish and the weather is very favorable for them to fish. So I was just wondering, how did you collect all, my question is directed to Theodore. How did you collect all this other information to be able to give more evidence to show that there are historical rights and they belong to A, B, C, D? Because like in the Western Indian Ocean, and I think most of African communities, they don't have that data. They just have oral tradition, and oral tradition changes depending on who is passing on that information. So maybe you can highlight how you did that, because I think it would be very beneficial in terms of the MSP that is being brought up. And I feel like, yes, it's conservation that is always going to get the upper hand. Economic benefits are always going to get the upper hand. Yet when these new projects are brought to the local communities, they are not getting the jobs because they don't have the qualifications. So you're killing a whole lifestyle because you want to progress or you want to meet, like you were saying. For me, it's like ticking the box. Yes, we've done this. We've been able to reach the SDG 14 or the SDG 3, you know. So like how were you able to give them evidence, and does it help when you go to the table?
Okay, right. So first of all, we've just started with this work. Okay, so it's ongoing. What we did was, first of all, in order that we get data that is as viable as possible, we first had to take the peculiarities of the local communities under account. So as I said, if you go to the mainland communities, and I repeat, that is because their lands have been degraded, they have been marginalized, they have been anything, you know, that if you tell them, they'll tell you it's all mine, you know, all of us, all of it is ours, you know, which is not really how it works. You know, the sea, it's all ours. That's because the sea is what's pretty much left. So what we did, you know, to start with was, you know, to actually, that's why we actually did the nomadic tribal routes, because we wanted to show that, okay, guys, you don't have to be, you know, so voracious about your rights in the sea, if you have any, because you have these wonderful, you know, huge pastoral areas. Now, the other thing that we did, so we started with the fishing rights. So we started with the islands first, and we did something with the mainland. We did not go to actually start and asking for fishing rights. And we didn't ask for fishing rights also on islands that had participated in what we call the trawler programs. In the 1950s, the government actually gave money from the Agricultural Bank to actually fund big trawler operations. And Meganisi, for example, from what we know, has trawlers that actually started with this program. So we started with really, really old people in the islands that we know had and people we knew had absolutely no stake to actually tell something which is not the case. Okay, so that was a really, really hard issue in an area that everyone is claiming bits and pieces for themselves right now, even the industry, you know, and the government and the conservation industry. Everyone wants to get a piece of it. So for us, we had to actually go to someone who we knew would actually, in our communities, people never participated in the trawler programs. They never participated in all these projects. Of course, they lost their fishery, our populations collapsed, they left. So, you know, at some point, but what we did was actually very, very simple. We just went to the really, really old people in the islands, in places we knew, and people we knew personally that they would not talk nonsense to us. Okay, that means you have to know the people. You have to know the individual peculiarities of the area. I'm a local, okay? And what also happens is I'm a local and we have a family tradition of doing charity work in the area. for medical purposes when there were no doctors. So they know and they trust us. So that's a little bit of a thing. They have to trust you, one thing. But you go to the really, really old people, 90 plus, 80 plus. And what happens is that you really need to search in the community to find the ones you know will know the things, okay? And we know that some of the really old people were not so, good at saying things, or they didn't know. But like what, 4 of them were brilliant. They're 90 plus each of them, but they were brilliant. And we worked with them and we designed the maps based on mostly what they told us. It wasn't so lengthy as a process, but it was difficult in the sense of actually knowing, who to talk to and how to talk to. But it wasn't hard. You just sit down, you find the people, you ask in the community who knows things about fish, who knows things about fishing, who remembers things, who's the old people who remember things, because there's old people who just don't remember anything. They're just, old people. That old doesn't mean they're wise. You find the old people who can tell you and remember details. I mean, they can tell you some things which are amazing for the fishery that I couldn't understand and comprehend before. But the crucial thing is that you actually focus on that, and it's done. It is not difficult. You just have to find the really old people. But at the same time, you have to be careful, because even the old people, you go 90 years back or 60 or 70 years back, that does not mean you've reached the baseline. In our area, the baseline was the 1830s. So for example, we used to have in the area, that is confirmed through museum specimens and other things. We had the European sturgeon, okay? Very big populations of European sturgeon, which don't exist anymore. So that has slipped from the memory of the community. The 95 plus people do not remember that fish. It's a very crucial, ecosystem indicator fish in the areas that it exists. So, you have to be careful as to the limitations of that. But as I said, you just sit with them, open-ended interviews. If they trust you, they give you, a paper that, you can actually use it in various ways. And that's it. It is not difficult, I repeat. But at the same time, you have to be careful as to who you talk to. Because what has happened with a lot of people in these things is that they go, for example, to the local government and they say, okay, who do I talk to, Mr. President? Or who do I talk to, Mr. Mayor? That's who you talk to. And the people they talk to are usually the wrong type of people, because they're the people who have stakes in things. So they're not going to tell you, for example, if you go to the main islands or to the mainland and you ask them, they'll tell you a very different story. But then their story is not really supported by other historical evidence. So it is like that. So you have to be careful as to who has stake and what. We went to people who we knew would absolutely have no stake at it, and they would be the wisest people to do it. And it wasn't a lot of them, but we did it. And one of them was actually part of a traditional governance system for managing land, a council of elders in his youth. So it worked out in that way. I think that answers your question. Okay.
The second part, maybe you were inquiring about how we gathered data about the historic nomadic routes. Were you wondering about that too?
Okay. Yes, we just searched the literature, extensive literature survey.
And so we found some historic maps from various reports that just showed where these nomads of these two different groups would go. And then we scanned and georeferenced those maps and then digitized them into ours to show the locations of where those routes were.
Very cool. I'm not quite sure if we're going to just be kicked out of the room or not. So, but I see that there's one more question. Well, there is one question, or Linus has his hand up. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted a brief question to Theo. The maps, participatory maps that you developed are quite exciting, I think, and I was using a bit of this approach also in my work. But I wanted to ask, did you try to test how accurate those maps are?
Well, so first of all, at this stage, this is preliminary work. Okay, so these maps may be corrected, borders may retract. We're going to add the other community blobs as they complement with each other for the other islands and the other areas. Tested, well, the proof is in the pudding, as they say, you know. So we're going to have to do some workshops in the end, you know, with all the communities. We wanted to do that. It was part of the process, but then coronavirus came. So we couldn't do that anymore. It's a process that is going to be, well, challenging because, you see, unlike many other parts, I've worked in Latin America, for example, and it's so easy to get people together there. Here they have this mentality that getting together is, you know, difficult. At the same time, testing it, we tried testing it. We have shown, so we have shown some preliminary maps to some of the elders that actually told us some things, and you know, they more or less agreed. The main difficulty is how people visualize space. So unlike, you know, here people do not visualize space if you just draw them on a map. They don't like that. They just say, from there to there, or from that place to that place, which is called like that. And, you know, then you have to put it together. And, you know, actually when you show it to them, they might do like, oh, you know, what's that? So that's the testing that we have done so far. We want to do what I told you, and we really, really want to go to the other communities. But, you know, as I said, I expect that we'll have to do it as a workshop, because we'll have to try and convince them that, you know, they shouldn't be clinging on to the sea so much, you know, in a sense, try and make them be as honest as possible. And that's why we actually we wanted to get the nomadic routes as well. But we have done only what I told you so far. We didn't have time simply because of COVID. But we do aim to do the workshops soon. People here are very eager. There is a lot of incentive to do something about the situation. Fortunately, there's a lot of political incentive to actually exploit the situation, but that's another, you know, sad part of the story. But that's how we've done it. Now, what I can tell you though is that what's very crucial is that these elders actually do have, you know, in this area, we have a system. Well, you can call it correct or not. There is a system based on gerontocracy. So if you're old, you know, everyone says they know. Okay, so you know, you don't dare say no to elders, especially older men. Whether or not that's something you agree with is entirely up to you, but that's how it works. So by going and focusing with these people, you actually have something which will probably not be very questioned, at least not at the level of the communities we did it, which was only the 2 islands, included what, 5 really, really old people, and then another 12 like really, really not so old people, out of a population of like less than 300 people. So that's all I can tell you for now. But it is a start. Okay, at least you know what I say is because these people are very old. You know, some of them may not be with us in 10 years from now. Really, honestly, you have to do it like this, and you have to digitize it. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I see there's another sort of comment from and question from Anya. In the interest of time, perhaps you guys can follow up on that outside of this space. Okay. Well, thank you very much to our presenters, and for those of you who joined us and who asked questions. I really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, hopefully we can continue offline as well. So thank you very much, and happy Friday to all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Of
Thanks,
course,
everyone.
thank you.
Everyone, thank